Welcome to the broadcast, everybody. Well, isn't this very curious? This curious case of the Frogmore cottage continues to captivate, doesn't it? Because the Times spoke to a source claiming to be close to the royal couple. And the Times are a respected publication, so it seems they have spoken to somebody who they believe is part of the Sussex camp. And this source, we can only imagine who that source might be, but this source seems to rebuff the suggestion that the Sussexes have had their nose put out of joint by this eviction. There is a need here, so it seems to control the narrative very much and make it seem as if, oh, they're not bothered, they don't care, they were expecting this. Well, this whole thing is very multi-layered, very multi-textured, you know. We'll go into that, but the source told the Times, this friend or associate of the couple, the world seems to be more distraught than they have been. It is what it is. They are not fighting it. They realize they have a home in California. They have a roof over their heads. They were very privileged to have a second residence. It's not going to work for them there, and that's okay. Change was inevitable. And they go on to say, if they come out to the UK in future and need to stay in a hotel, then that complicates things. Well, I thought it was very patronising, this message. Very patronising. And also passive-aggressive in tone. A desperate wish to control the narrative and tell everybody with those big megawatt smiles, we don't care, we expect it, we don't care about Frogmore. Well, firstly, I want to say that when I first addressed this Frogmore matter on the day that it emerged, on the day that the whispers emerged, I also shared with you a whisper that I had heard, that this whole affair could involve recompense for the Sussexes and the £2.4 million that they paid out for the refurbishment. And I only mention this because it was only after my broadcast emerged that this subject of compensation was proliferated in the world's media. So I certainly wasn't following on from the media, and if you watched my broadcast you will know that. I actually laid it down. And I also feel that I want to lay my cards down at this point and say that I do believe that refurbishment was entirely reasonable. You know, this was a fairly large home that was carved into 5 different properties. It needed to be pulled into the 21st century. It needed a makeover and it needed to be made royal. You know, I like royalty to be royalty. And when the Duke and Duchess were married, I wanted them to live in the sort of style that second prince and Duke and Duchess should live in within the kingdom. And you're going to have to excuse me if I'm not extraordinarily eloquent, but this matter is multi-layered, multi-textured, and there's quite a lot bubbling under the surface, and has been for some time. That matter of compensation, from the whispers I have heard, has had a lot to do with stalemating behind the scenes. And I'm going to be cautious about what I say, and you're going to have to read a little bit in between the lines, here and there. But all is not exactly as it appears, and don't assume that the Harkles didn't want out of Windsor and Frogmore Cottage. Anyway, don't assume that they're devastated to lose Frogmore, even though they grew to rather like it there during the very short period they lived there. Because they had already burned bridges. They had already burned all their bridges and had made that conscious decision to do so. They'd burned their bridges, and if it wasn't already an albatross around their neck, it would have become more so in time. A lot of the chess moves behind the scenes have to do with the leasehold arrangement of Frogmore Cottage. And it's interesting that we are on the topic of leaseholds, because in my previous broadcast I had discussed a dream property that I'd found online, and lots of you loved it too. a Jacobean apartment. And I mentioned in that broadcast that although it was going for what appeared to be a bargain price of £500,000, it only had 78 years remaining on its lease. And for those of you that aren't in the kingdom, and even for some of you that are, it was confusing because you hadn't hold of these leasehold arrangements before and what they mean. And so I will go into a little bit about that during this broadcast. But when the Queen gifted Frogmore Cottage as a wedding gift to the Harkles, you have to understand that that doesn't mean they then owned the property. It meant that they owned the right to live there while under leasehold arrangement for a certain period of time. And we're not privy to how long that period of time is. We hear the lease was renewed last year. But Frogmore Cottage remains property of the Crown Estate, now represented by our sovereign, the King. The Crown Estate is the freeholder that owns the property and the land the property sits on. The Harkles are the leaseholders. They are tenants of the freeholder. And although this is a royal estate, you have the Crown Estate and you have the two duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall. So King Charles, for example, is landlord to many residential properties that are on the Duchy of Cornwall, for example, and is paid rent by his tenants. Well, it's the same under this affair for the Crown Estate and Frogmore Cottage, and under a freeholder's leasehold arrangement. Yes, the freeholder, then the leaseholder. Under that arrangement, the leaseholder has to pay a service charge and a ground rent, and oftentimes that ground rent is what they call a peppercorn rent, so it'll be just a few quid here and there to tide one over. Service charge can vary greatly. You know, if you live in a large block of luxury flats that are shared by 75 other people, or you live in number 1 Hyde Park, then the service charge is going to be, well, it could run for anything into the tens of thousands every year of service charge for the upkeep and the maintenance of communal areas, bike sheds, communal gardens, the buildings insurance, any number of these kind of things. But before I go on holding forth about leasehold agreements, I will share with you the latest whisper that I've heard, which is why this whole affair is very multi-textured, because the whisper that I've heard is that yes, it has indeed left, I should say, the imaging and the optics of how this has played out has left the Harkles in somewhat of a blind fury, actually, because it does make them look as if they have egg on their face, as much as they or their sources might deny it. But the reason that it is multi-textured is also that from another aspect, they knew that if they were evicted by the Crown, if they were evicted instead of leaving voluntarily, then that would have ramifications with regards to the leaseholder agreement and to the millions of pounds that they had spent for its upkeep and for its refurbishment. And it is also possible, and has been reported in the papers as a possibility, that they've paid long-term rent up front. So as well as there being a possible legal obligation for them to be compensated for the refurbishment, there is also much more of a moral obligation for them to be compensated. So there is that aspect to bear in mind. But I will lay my cards on the table and tell you that, in contrast to what others might say, I do believe that they are entitled to compensation for the millions spent, because I think there is often a temptation to hear about this gift from the Queen and rush in to judge. And as I'll tell you in a moment, there are certain harsh judgments that I make with all asperity with regards to the Harkles' behaviour. But there is also a side of the lollipop that wasn't quite so delicious for the Harkles, was fuzzy, and deserves, in fairness, to be looked at. Because remember, this was called a gift from the Queen, and I think there is a temptation to rose tint that gift, because the onus was on the Queen to gift some sort of property for a Duke and Duchess that would be working for her and devoting their lives to her. That was the idea. We all know how things panned out. Anyone can live a life of service. Not royal service, lovey. Maybe at the Playboy Mansion. The Queen's gift, as I say, she could only gift the right to occupy Frogmore Cottage, not to own it. And as we've seen, this requires lease renewals, and in their case required a refurbishment that eventually came out of their own pocket. It did, no matter what you say. It was not fit for purpose beforehand, and I believe that £2.4 million, although it's a lot, and yes, they paid it back, I think it's a reasonable amount for a property that was 5 dwelling places before they converted it into 1. And the idea, although we know that, or we have the hunch that Miss Ragland might have had more international aspirations, shall we say, from the get-go, from when she laid eyes on Harry, and I wouldn't have put it past him too to want to escape as quick as a flash. But the idea is that it would be their base for a very long time, if not for life, as a second family home. When you look at that gift in the cold light of day, it's not so much of a generous gift. It is a sort of conditional offering. And I do think that that particular gift came at a price, the price of living in a gilded cage. It also meant that security for the Harkles would be a lot cheaper because it's part of the Windsor estate. So if they had been placed somewhere else in the country on their own, then they would have had to have a completely separate security detail and intelligence. So in many regards, I'm actually not as critical and I'm more understanding than other quarters. And I think that they, in the main, behaved with scruples down to paying back to that money. But that does not excuse them. And I do criticise them for going public with such things as the interiors, for putting them on Netflix documentaries. This is rather unprecedented, and it throws daylight onto magic. This is where my criticism comes in. And all the complaining they did about Nottingham Cottage before that, how small it was. And they might have had very good points, not that I care what Oprah Winfrey thinks of them. But, William and Catherine lived there for a couple of years before them, if it's good enough for the future king and queen. And my biggest bugbear was, and continues to be, the fact that there was no neat dissociation. When they went, they should have quit using their ducal titles of Duke and Duchess, quit using that all over their merch, over their paraphernalia, and just become Harry and Meghan. And they should have got on with leading productive, industrious lives without putting our king's name in their mouth, our kingdom's name in their mouth on Oprah Winfrey, and causing all kinds of reputational damage and harm to the institution and the country, as well as their own family. They are the main objections. And if they hadn't have acted with such lack of valour and dignity and honour in the face of leaving that family, then I would have had more respect for them getting on with what they want to do and leading a life, but not referring back to royalty and how terrible it is all the time, because it's just not royal, and yet you still call yourselves royal. And that directly affects me. This is, people might say, why do you care what they do? Why does it affect you? Because it is my country. It is my monarch. I live in a constitutional monarchy, and the reputation of this country and its people directly affects me. And it has directed the reputation. It affected the reputation of the Commonwealth, as we all know, in the final years of the late Queen's reign. I do apologise, by the way, if what I'm saying to you comes over as somewhat clumsy or even boring, because the last thing that I want to do is bore you, but there are strange questions hovering over the King's move here, the Harkles' reaction, and I'm trying to cover and broach a lot of the issues that you've asked me about, and that I'm trying to tell you about as well, behind the scenes. But for those of you who asked in the comment section, and there were quite a few of you who didn't understand what leasehold arrangements were, and if that meant that you couldn't buy and own a property in the kingdom. No, it doesn't mean that. You can. It's your choice. You have the option to buy your own property or buy a leasehold property. But there are 4.8 million leasehold dwellings in the kingdom, which is 20% of English housing stock. So if you take all of the stock in England, all of the housing stock, 20% of that are leasehold properties. And of that 20%, 58% of those are owner occupied, so the people that own them live in them, and 37% of them are privately owned and let in the private rented sector, with the remaining 6% of those dwellings owned by social landlords and let in the social rented sector. And most of those leasehold dwelling places are flats. You know, they normally apply to buildings with multiple dwelling places within them that have shared spaces, communal gardens, all the rest of it. And leasehold properties are much more prevalent in London, where there are about 33% leasehold properties, and also in the northwest with about 30%, and then it diminishes dramatically for the rest of the country. So it's mainly London and the northwest. And the individuals or the estates or the groups or companies that own the property and the land that the property sits on are known as freeholders. And it is leaseholders that purchase the right to occupy the property for a number of years. So as I said, Frogmore is owned by the Crown Estate. They are the freeholders. And it's not always royal families or even aristocratic families who are the freeholders. It can be any individual. The freehold can be purchased by any individual, purchased or inherited, which is the case for a lot of what we call the grand estates. And you will find a lot of those grand estates in London. And by the way, a property with a long, healthy lease can be put on the property market for a lot more than one with a dwindling lease. So the property that I showed you in the previous broadcast with only 78 years remaining, that is a very small lease, which is basically running out, even though 78 years sounds like a lot. A healthy lease, well, they can run up to 999 years, but you always want them sort of in the hundreds, at least somewhere in the hundreds. And when they go beyond 90 years, then the market value of the property really goes down. And that is why you will see lovely properties like the one I showed you in the last broadcast at what seems and appears to be a really nice price, but what it actually means is that because the lease is running out, you're going to have to be shelling out for a renewal on that lease, which is negotiated with the freeholder in the passage of time. So it's not quite the bargain that it may appear, but I don't want to speak for that specific property. It might not cost that much to renew the lease, but it can run into a lot of money. You know, if you hop around property websites, as I do from time to time, and have a look around, sometimes you'll spot some fabulous 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in Belgravia or in Mayfair, and it seems to be going for shekels, you know. It seems to be going for just a few £100,000. You think, how is that possible? But time and experiences teaches you that as soon as you click on it, you'll see that it probably only has 7 years remaining on the lease, something really, really tiny. So that would mean that you only are buying the right to occupy that dwelling place, that fabulous flat, for the last remaining 7 years. And because there's only 7 years left on the lease, if it's going to be renewed, then it'll be costing a lot more than a few £100,000 in such a grand location. Many of our older London townhouses and residences, as well as blocks of flats and apartments, you'll see 4 or 5 story houses which have been broken up over the decades to form, several flats instead of one big house. And in that case, the freehold is normally held by some other party, but you can sometimes club together and purchase the freehold collectively, and that is known as share of freehold. So you'll see that option coming up sometimes. And why am I caring to talk about leasehold arrangements on a channel that tends to revolve around subjects of royalty? Well, number one, I can talk about whatever I like. The channel's called River, and it gives me the freedom to discuss whatever I want at any time. But secondly, it does involve royalty directly because it is rooted in royal history and aristocratic history. And there is a feudal distinction between freeholder and tenant, because that is what you are when you purchase a leasehold property. You are the tenant of the freeholder. So you're still renting, really. A lot of people think that when they purchase a leasehold property, that's the end of their renting years. Well, really, it's still a form of renting, really, from your freeholder. But it has its roots in the 11th century. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many grand estates. Well, not many, there are a handful of grand estates. And, for example, much of London is owned by the direct lineage from aristocratic families, and there are 5 main ones of them. And one of the reasons that it's a little bit juicy to bring this to your attention, and this is absolutely no word of a lie, that one of the heads of these 5 families, these grand estate families, one of the heads, the living heads, who is a member of the British peerage, is a viewer of the River broadcast. Yes, and has contacted me on several occasions. And this person and their spouse are beloved members of this community. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. We're talking about somebody who owns much of London and much of the ground that you will have trodden on if you're a London tourist or a resident. They are basketeers, and very sexy ones too, I've got to tell you, with a lovely fruity sense of humour. Yes, indeed. And no, you shan't be able to guess which I'm talking about, because I'm not going to make it at all obvious, and I would never betray their confidence. So if you happen to be watching this episode, my dears, have no fear. I will not be betraying your confidence. But I will list the 5 families in alphabetical order. There is the Bedford family, the Cadoggans, the De Waldens, the Grosvenors, and the Portmans. And if you live in London, you'll be familiar with all these names because you'll see them all around you all the time. But prime central London is owned by just these handful of families, really. And they were created, these grand estates, by landed aristocrats, and the estates have remained in their families. So these families are the stewards and custodians of these grand estates that came into being, as I say, going back to the 11th century, before London was all built up. Much of it was manors. So, for example, the Grosvenor estate that I mentioned, much of that covers what is now Mayfair and Belgravia, which you would have heard of as, very grand estates, grand parts of London. And that Grosvenor estate is owned by who is now the 6th Duke of Westminster. And that grand estate you can trace all the way back to 1677, which it was then a manor of Ebury, and that was inherited. 500 acres north of the River Thames, and through all that time they remain the family with the rights to the land and the property that is built on that land. So through all those hundreds of acres, whether it's residential or commercial, the shops on all the high streets, they have to lease those premises and buildings from the freeholder. So it is a sort of ancient arrangement that is very complex, has advantages and disadvantages, and there are calls for its abolishment. And I would say that a total abolishment is very, very unlikely. But I think reforms to the system in general are coming. There's been a lot of hoo-ha about it in the press over the last few years. Reforms are coming to improve some of the systems, especially residential. And I do agree that there is a sense of unfairness, if you want to put it that way, about the system, although nobody is literally forced into becoming a leaseholder. So let's draw a line under leaseholder agreements, shall we? I'm not an estate agent. I've got no desire to be an estate agent, and I'm never going to be able to speak flawlessly and immaculately on those sort of subjects on which I have no expertise. I'm just bringing it to you in the spirit of addressing some of your questions, particularly for those of you abroad who aren't familiar with such things. So please just take it in that chit-chat spirit, my dears, and do your own investigations and your own research. Thank you. But some lovely images emerged of the anointing oil that will be used during the coronation. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the chrism oil, which will be used to anoint the king at the coronation in May, has been consecrated by the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem. The oil has been created using olives that are harvested from the 2 groves on the Mount of Olives at the Monastery of Mary Magdalene and the Monastery of the Ascension. The Monastery of Mary Magdalene is the burial place of His Majesty's grandmother, the Mad Princess Alice of Greece. The coronation oil is based on the oil that was used at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the formula of which has been used for hundreds of years, and it will also be used for the anointing of Her Majesty the Queen Consort. She's escaped again, Fergie the Lurgie, out and about, and you really can't miss her, my dear. You really can't. I don't know if she's channeling Barbara Cartland, and if she is, I think she's misfired a little bit, bless her heart, because we have this pink Savoy affair. Oh, Sarah dear, Sarah dear. It's like a pink Savoy, isn't it? Or one of those wieners splitting in the saucepan. I don't know. This outfit she wore, when she posted the arrangement on Instagram, I actually think she got away with it. I think it looked really rather nice there, but it did not translate well in real life. No, it didn't. No. And, I'm not accusing her of being the Duchess of Pork or anything like that, she used to be called. It's nothing to do with her size. Actually, I like her size. I think she's a really nice size. I know she's been self-conscious about it in the past, but I think she's an attractive woman with a nice body and a nice shape. But here she looks like she squeezed herself inside a pair of pink marigolds, my dear, or stitched it together out of some sort of PVC tablecloth, I ask you. She's promoting her new novel, you see, or her new co-authored novel, I should say. Although there were some lovely photographs of her, because she did an exclusive interview with The Telegraph, where they tried to coax some information out of her with regards to Meghan. And she looked really lovely in those photographs. Beautiful, beautiful blue eyes and a nice dark look there. And then she did wear magenta again, and they were really lovely. She can look very nice. And she was asked what is her best advice that she was given by the late Queen. And apparently the best advice was, be yourself, Sarah. All anyone wants is for you to just be yourself. And she spoke about the Queen's ability to listen and never judge, and how they used to go on lots of walks with the dogs, and how the dogs, Sandy and Mick, the little corgis, are still missing the Queen, but she breaks up their digestive biscuits for them as the Queen did, because they like the sound of the biscuits being broken, and she feeds them biscuits as the Queen used to. And Fergie says that the Queen was able to completely and utterly dilute chaos and still carry on and still smile and still go through everything that she went through. She says during the last 3 years, her poor son, Andrew, has been going through such a tumultuous time, and I think Her Majesty was very relieved that I could help her with him, so we became even closer then. But I've always admired and adored her, says Sarah. Really, she was more of a mother to me than my mother. And she's rather cagey. She knows she's going to be quizzed on Meghan and Harry, but the journalist, the reporter, tries to get it in there. And Sarah reveals something. It was a bit of a shocker, really. I don't really know Meghan, she says. I haven't really met her. Now, doesn't that surprise some of you? She's barely had any interactions with her, apparently. I spoke to her at the funeral, says Fergie, and I thought she looked absolutely beautiful. She is beautiful, if you squint. She's asked, has Meghan damaged the royal family? And Fergie says, it is absolutely not my place to answer that. Well, Fergie's got a point after some of the stuff that she and her hubby have gotten up to over the years. Anyway, she says, she has made Harry very happy, And that is so nice. Honestly, he's so happy with her. She really loves him. And I really think that's so beautiful. And that Diana would be so proud of him and her lovely grandchildren. So this may be confusing to some, but remember, the royal way is to kill with kindness. And although she's not from an especially aristocratic family, she is from a military family with aristocratic connections and old money. So she understands how to approach the line and not cross it. In some ways, I mean, not so much by her actions, let it be said, not so much by many of her vulgar actions, as endearing as she can be. Actions not so good, but when it comes to words, she's a little more cautious. Knows how to get attention and say something without saying much at all, if you know what I mean. And that's what she does in this interview, because she knows she'll get more promotion for her book if she holds forth a little on the Duke and Duchess, but if she actually says nothing much other than niceties. Fergie is asked if she watched the Sussexes documentary, and basically she did, but she doesn't want to just come out and say it. So she widens her eyes but stays silent. When I repeat the question, the Duchess holds up a finger. I'm just trying to think. Right. She's formulated a response. So, I think I'm a devourer of information on Netflix, okay? And I love watching everything on Netflix. The interviewer says, what am I supposed to do with that? And Fergie chuckles and says, I also think that one day I'd like to do a documentary. A similar one, she's asked. Heaven forbid. And Fergie says, I don't know, I can't be led. Shutting down the conversation. She's actually rather complimentary about Harry and this, and understands why he loves America. She loved living in America and understands why. Understanding. But you have to understand, this is the royal way. I mean, we saw the Queen damaged and harmed so very much. We saw Prince Edward asked about Harry in the wake of his revelations on Oprah Winfrey, and all he would say, although I'm sure he as a human being must have been fuming underneath at much of the damage and the harm that's been caused to his mother and his brother, he only showed the side that was understanding and graceful and said, well, we've all been through it. We've all been through what Harry's been through, and sort of made various noises of understanding. That is called humility and grace. And many people from all around the globe who are usually only witness to celebrity and the PR machinations of celebrity do not understand that royalty and much of the aristocracy in general do not operate in the same way, and will simply refuse point blank to show their ire at such things. That is why it is so obscene to see Harry betray this well-worn, well-weathered style, and it is why Catherine and William make such an elegant contrast, because although initially people might have thought that their response, or the Queen's, their lack of response, was weak and cowardly, as I've said before, we've seen over the passage of time, who are the ones that now look weak and who are the ones that now look strong. It is a tried and tested and true path. So although I'm sure that, this ebullience from Fergie has some root in authenticity, I would also wager that behind the scenes conversations with Andrew and with other members of the family aren't quite so peppered with love and feelings of affection for Harry. But that is the royal way. Malice and spite, no matter how it is shrouded and dressed up, is never going to appeal to the right people. And Spare is a good example of that, because, it's malice on stilts, it's spite on stilts. You can dress it up however you want, but it might as well have been called Revenge instead of Tom Bower's book, because that was why it was issued, revenge as well as in pursuit of the filthy lucre. And everybody could see it and everybody knew it. And she deploys the same technique in talking about the king. And if press reports are to be believed, there is friction between Prince Andrew and the king, and the supposed downgrading from Royal Lodge to Frogmore Cottage. And she deploys the same technique when she's asked about the king and the coronation, because she says, I think it'll be an extraordinary moment, and I feel really strongly that the king is brilliant. He upholds everything that is good. I mean, what he's done for the environment, what he's done in his life, how he loves to paint, how he loves to walk, how he loves to be. And it isn't that she doesn't mean any of those things, but it's, it is a matter of being selective. No matter if it's Harry she's talking about, Meghan, or Charles, they're all brilliant, they're all wonderful, they're all lovely, they're all great, even though the king is whipping out Royal Lodge from under your feet as you speak, my dear. But this girl knows where her bread is buttered. She's been getting it buttered at the same dairy for years, and what she doesn't want to do is insult the owner of that dairy farm, does she? That's churning out all that butter for her bread. If you're a fan of Antiques Roadshow, you can watch the Queen make her appearance on it tomorrow, I believe, on Sunday. It was filmed last summer when she was the Duchess of Cornwall. It was filmed at the Eden Project, and she presents a rare all-English Cornish silver snuff box for inspection. It's from the Royal Collection, and it's to be valued on Antiques Roadshow, so it'll be interesting to see what they say about that. And she also brought with her a rare book from her own family's collection that had been handed down through the ages, Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And in 1899, it was actually bound by the Guild of Women Binders. And Fiona Bruce, one of the presenters, said, the Queen Consort was just terrific fun. She put everyone at ease and was keen to take part in the programme and chat to everyone. Some information has been released with regards to the King's state visit to Europe next month. He's going to be in France and Germany. In fact, Paris, Bordeaux, Hamburg and Berlin are the known locations. 6-day visit to underline the government's desire to build on historic links with the continent. It will celebrate the UK's relationship with both our shared histories, culture and values. Royal tours are taken at the request of the government and following invitations from President Macron and President Steinmeier. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to catch up with you in the next broadcast. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and my tip jar is in the description box below. Bye for now, and toodle pip. Ta-ra!